I'm Dean Allison, and welcome to the Hill Update. The past week in Parliament has been very interesting. I'm sure you're aware about the government's use of mandatory hotel quarantines for travellers returning to Canada. And yes, the plan is already in place. Ottawa has approved 11 hotels in Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and the Vancouver regions, the only 4 airports in Canada currently accepting international flights. In order to board the plane flying to Canada, you must have a negative PCR COVID test. Upon arrival in one of the 4 airports, you will once again be tested and await the results in a federally approved hotel. These hotels could cost up to $2,000. What you may not have heard, however, is the evidence that supports the use of these mandatory hotels. Does the data say that they are more effective than quarantine at home while you await your COVID test results? How about rapid testing? What happened to the government's plans to put rapid testing into widespread use, especially in airports? Rapid tests were being used in Alberta as part of a pilot project for returning travelers. But because of the federal government's new policy, Alberta has suspended this program. Alberta's own Michelle Gardner, Conservative Shadow Minister for Health, recently asked numerous senior government officials from the Public Health Agency of Canada about the effectiveness of quarantine hotels as opposed to quarantining at home or rapid testing. In fact, she asked them twice. Both times she was met with, yes, silence. They couldn't answer, they didn't have the data, and this data is the evidence. You can watch her video on her Facebook page. It is really quite something. What this means is the government put in place mandatory hotel quarantines for all returning passengers, and yet government officials don't know whether this policy would be effective or not. In the last few days, there has been the reports of sexual violence at the Montreal facility, and the Conservatives are calling for a suspension of the program until the government can assure travelers of their safety. I'm sure there'll be more on this in the coming days. Lastly, because the hotels are mandatory for all arriving passengers, there's already criticism from constitutional law experts saying that forced quarantine of returning Canadians is a serious violation of Sections 6, 7, 9, 10, and 11 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Jay Cameron, litigation director at the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, says that if a Canadian tests positive in Canada, they quarantine in their house. And there's no reason for a returning Canadian to be compelled to quarantine in a federal facility under threat of arrest and large fines. Mandatory hotel quarantines are no doubt a contentious issue, and we'll probably hear a lot more about them in the future. What's also contentious is Bill C-7, also known as the Medical Assistance in Dying Bill, or MAID for short. This is a very sensitive piece of legislation. On February 23rd, MPs debated the Senate amendments to the bill. There were a few amendments included. One of the most critical was that mental illness can be the sole underlying reason for choosing MAID. The Trudeau government agrees with the Senate on this amendment. Persons with disabilities and medical professionals say that the expansion of MAID in Bill C-7 is dangerous and requires more scrutiny. There are also those who feel that rather than focusing on ending life, the government should include increased funding for palliative care and provide better supports for people living with disabilities and for those suffering from mental health issues. Disability rights advocates maintain that Bill C-7 sends the message that life with a disability is a fate far worse than death. I believe it's the government's job to protect everyone, especially the vulnerable, and uphold Canadians' constitutional rights. I don't believe, and many of my Conservative colleagues would also agree, that the Senate amendments and the government's support for those amendments don't go far enough to protect the most vulnerable, especially seniors and those living with mental illness and disabilities. Liberal MPs will vote for the bill. At this point, it's not clear how the NDP and the Bloc will vote. The Conservative Party and their members will have a free vote, and I, for one, will not be supporting the amendments or the bill itself. And that is the Hill update for this week. When we come back from break, we are going to find out one of the reasons we have become so dependent on China for everything we buy. We'll be talking with Jocelyn Bamford, and we will be discussing the state of manufacturing in Canada. Joining me on the show this week is Jocelyn Bamford, founder of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers, also vice president of Automatic Coating Limited. Jocelyn, welcome to the show. So talk to me a little bit about...
Happy to be here.
Yes, I'm so glad to have you here. Talk to me a bit about why you founded the Coalition for Concerned Manufacturers.
Well, we started the coalition 4 years ago because we were concerned about the competitiveness of manufacturing in Ontario, specifically under the previous Liberal government in Ontario. And it started with the Green Energy Program, which piled on costs to small to medium-sized manufacturers, and then the Cap and Trade program, which really impacted, again, small to medium-sized manufacturers because it increased the cost of their natural gas and their diesel for transportation. So it was a death by 1,000 cuts. We were competing against goods that come in from offshore that did not have to pay these types of costs, and it made us very uncompetitive. And we continue to see that piled on from now the federal government, and we see that through increase in carbon tax and the new clean fuel standards. And we can't even get some of the projects that we need to get done, such as in the resource sector. And that very much impacts manufacturing because almost as many manufacturers in Ontario support the resource sector as support the automotive sector. And people just don't seem to understand that. If you look at our street, our small industrial street in Scarborough, there's 4 companies that produce parts for the resource sector. So not only are we in a competitive situation that is very detrimental to manufacturers, we can't even get projects underway that would help us produce parts.
So as we look at what's happened around COVID, I think that's really exposed a lot of things. PPE, we don't produce a lot of it. Vaccines, in terms of manufacturing, there does seem to be this diminishing ability for Canadians to make things and manufacture things. And so you started talking about why some of these things are. So talk to me, why is this happening? And my sense is it's getting worse. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we all saw because of COVID how vulnerable we were as a nation because we had parts and pieces manufactured offshore, gloves, gowns, ventilators. And so we have a great opportunity to bring manufacturing back. But in order to do that, you have to have affordable energy. And we do not have affordable energy in this country because we're adding cost, excessive taxes on manufacturers, and that makes it very expensive to produce parts here. And again, we're competing against nations that don't have those taxes added on. And so it drives manufacturing out. In fact, in our coalition, there's quite a few companies that left Ontario and Canada because they got inexpensive energy, some of which is produced in Ontario and offloaded to the United States at a loss. So we're actually subsidizing manufacturing in another country. And we've been asking for a national strategy on manufacturing. A lot of manufacturing drives high-skilled, highly paid jobs. And we have such an opportunity now to retrench that manufacturing and make sure that we have jobs not only for our employees and their families, but for our kids, for their future. Such a great opportunity, such innovation in Canada for manufacturing, and that should be celebrated.
Well, and manufacturing, as I know you're well aware, pays very well in terms of jobs. So those are always great. You talked about energy. We got about a minute left. Talk to us about the cost of energy here in Ontario versus other parts in the country. And then, of course, the U.S. is where I know people are moving some of their businesses to. We got about 60 seconds for that.
So one of our manufacturers moved their operation to the States and saved $400,000 in electricity, didn't have the carbon tax. And we're also competing with the new designation of designating plastics as toxic, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's a $35 billion industry in Canada. And if plastics were toxic, why would we wrap our food in it? And certainly plastics has been the hero of COVID, protecting us from further infections. And all of these things lead us to believe that the federal government wants to drive industry out of this country because that's what they're doing. They're doing it through the resource sector. the manufacturing sector, and now the plastic sector. And those costs, especially in carbon tax, are outrageous. Our carbon tax is going to go to $195,000 in 2024.
Hold that thought. We'll talk about plastics when we come back from break, okay?
Okay.
Joining me on the show this week is Jocelyn Bamford, who's the founder of the Coalition for Concerned Manufacturers. So we just started talking before the break on plastics, and I don't think most people really understand what's going on. I mean, the government's sort of declared war on single-use plastics. Talk to us about, I don't think people have any idea what's going on when it comes to plastics. Talk to us about what you're hearing, what's going on, and what this could mean to not only our economy here in Ontario, but to across the country.
Right. So the federal government, under the CEPA legislation, are designating plastics as toxic. So there's a couple problems with that. One, they're getting around taking that to the legislative body to agree on that. And this is huge for Canada, $35 billion industry, which would be driven out. We had one of our plastics manufacturers that was actually going to bring a plant back from China. But now with this designation of plastics as toxic, they see no future in this country. So not only is it going to decimate industries here and jobs here, but it's going to prevent people from investing in Canada. And that's what we really need now. We need a lot of investment into Canada so that we can bring back jobs. And especially with COVID, we need to retrench our economy, and declaring plastics as toxic will just drive industry out.
Well, one of the things I know that, this current government's sort of war on the, on resources, et cetera, has actually cost us billions and billions of dollars of investments already. And you're saying it's not just in resources, but it's in industries like plastics as well.
Right. It seems like they're driving out the resource sector, the manufacturing sector, and the plastic sector. And if you look at the GDP contributors to Canada's economy, number 2 is manufacturing, number 3 is the resource sector. So you can't just drive those two sectors out and figure that you're going to replace it with anything. And I know that they talk about green jobs. Well, we saw that in Ontario under the Green Energy program, and those jobs never materialized. They went offshore. So, all you have to do is look at the experience in Ontario to see that the experience in Canada will mirror that. And what the experience was? It was a loss of jobs. It was a loss of companies. And it's a loss of prosperity. And that's not what we want. We want to grow the economy. We want to bring manufacturing back. And we want to have resource sector jobs that are very high paying. And what that will do is not only lead to prosperity here in Canada, but it will lead to a cleaner planet, because the need for fossil fuels is going to happen regardless of where Canada is participating or not. They're just going to buy their fossil fuels from other countries that don't have the environmental protection that we have in Canada. So we'll see job losses and we'll see a dirtier planet. That's a lose-lose. When we could have a win-win, we could have great jobs, high-paying jobs, getting our clean liquefied natural gas to market, and also having areas like China and India come off coal. So that is a win-win situation, and one that we could easily turn our economy around and bring back high-paying jobs.
So we got about a minute and a half left here. Single-use plastic ban, right, which was sort of the thought process. Most people, I don't think, understand how much this affects, like, every day. So why don't we spend the next minute? Why don't you tell us about, what this really means to our economy in terms of where plastics are used in everyday life? I don't think people would understand how devastating this would be to not only to our manufacturers, those that produce plastics, but in terms of, what would we do?
And we're a world leader in the circular economy. There's the companies here in Canada that have Ice River Springs Water, who produces 100% recyclable water bottles. We are a leader in the first medical recycling waste, so taking waste from medical devices and recycling them into new items. This is world class. This is world leading. This is exportable. And instead of embracing that and seeing what our industry can do, the federal government, under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, is trying to declare plastics as toxic. And the legislation, although they claim it's just going to be straws and plastic bags, the declaring of plastics as toxic is very broad-based and can include a whole bunch of other plastics products that people just don't think are part of that act. And this is going to be very devastating to Canada.
When we come back for break, let's talk about what we can do to fix this. Joining me on the show this week is Jocelyn Bamford, the founder of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and also Vice President of Automotive Coatings Limited. So we got big issues in this country. We just talked about manufacturing leaving, the fact that we can't deal with this. We can't even supply our own PPE and a number of these things that COVID has just shown us how vulnerable we are. How are we going to solve these problems, Jocelyn? What are we going to do?
So there's a very easy fix. First of all, we need a strategy for manufacturing. We need a strategy for resources. We need to get our natural resources to market, because that's going to lead to a cleaner planet and jobs and prosperity here. We need to get rid of the carbon tax, because the carbon tax is burdening manufacturers and making us uncompetitive. We need to have an open environment to attract investment here. And we're not going to do that if we declare plastics as toxic. We're going to drive investment away. We've seen that we've driven investment away from the resource sector. We see that we're driving away from the plastic sector. We see we've driven it away from manufacturing. We need to understand and benchmark how competitive we are in those areas compared to the rest of the world. And we need to make sure that we are creating a competitive environment, because those are high-paying, high-skilled jobs, and it will lead us to prosperity. And you know, do we want to have jobs for our kids? I say yes. I want to have jobs for my kids. And really, when you think about it, the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada is really the Coalition of Concerned Employers of Canada. We're concerned for our employees, and we want to make sure that they have a very good standard of living for them and their families, and that their kids have jobs in the future. And it's such an easy fix. You just need to not be ideologically driven. You need to be science and economically driven. And it can be a win-win solution. And it's so easy to achieve. I can't understand why the federal government's reticent in doing that. Well,
I mean, you look at it, I mean, we've got an amazing workforce, right? Educated workforce. We've got a great resource sector. I mean, really, we've got resource. There's a lot of, we're the envy of the world, really, when it comes to all the tools that we have in the toolkit in order to make us, competitive. And yet, somehow our policies, we keep missing the mark on what we can do to actually encourage manufacturers to do that. Because, the point you used was $400,000 was energy alone, right? And that doesn't, take into consideration some of the other things.
That was just electricity. They're not going to have to pay carbon tax. And those things add up, and they add up very quickly and make us uncompetitive. And, we have such innovation in Canada. So let's take some of that innovation and spread it around the world. But in order to do that, we have to have affordable energy, and we have to be able to export our resources. We need to attract investment, and we need to keep high-skilled, good-paying jobs here in Canada. And we can do that. We just have to have the will to do it. And I don't understand why we just don't get on with it.
So listen, we got about a minute and a half left. Give us some final advice, some final words you'd leave us with in terms of the viewers. What couple things could we do today so that we can ensure our manufacturing sector for tomorrow?
We can make sure that this becomes an election issue. So if someone's knocking at the door, think about the people in your life that work for a manufacturer, work for the resource sector, work in the plastic sector, and ask those politicians, what are they going to do to make sure that we're taking care of our second and third GDP contributors and grow middle class, high paying jobs here in Canada.
That's great. Well, listen, Jocelyn, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I think what we'll do is we're going to have you back to talk about plastics. I think we could probably spend a show on plastics, really trying to educate people on what's going on there.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to leave you with is if you're a commuter and you're driving into wherever, think about the clean fuel standards and the carbon tax is going to cost you on your commute. And a lot of people are leaving the city to go to the suburbs and farther out because of COVID, but they maybe haven't looked at the balance sheet of how much it's going to cost them to commute. We've seen carbon taxing double during a pandemic. We're seeing clean fuel standards come in, and this is going to impact everybody. If you are a public sector employee right now and you have a pension that you're counting on, you should reflect upon the unfunded pension liabilities. That means how much money is not accounted for in your pension. And without a good private sector, we're not going to have a robust public sector. So it really does impact every Canadian.
Thank you, Jocelyn. We appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
It looks like we need to look at manufacturing and what we can do to help create some great jobs for tomorrow. Thanks for joining me on the Hill Update this week.